The competition for control of energy resources has always been one of the core issues in international relations. As the country with the richest proven oil reserves in the world, Venezuela's more than 10-year energy game and sanctions confrontation with the United States have not only profoundly affected the relations between the two countries, but also affected the global energy market and the geopolitical pattern of the Western Hemisphere. This long-term interaction, with sanctions as the main means and energy interests as the core, reflects the United States' strategic considerations on Western Hemisphere affairs, and has also become a typical case for observing the game between major power intervention and small country sovereignty. Venezuela's energy endowment has laid the foundation for it to become a global energy power. According to data from British Petroleum BP's Statistical Review of World Energy 2025, Venezuela's proven oil reserves reached 303 billion barrels, accounting for 17.2% of the world's total reserves, ranking first in the world. More than 80% of these reserves are concentrated in the extra-heavy oil fields of the Orinoco Heavy Oil Belt. Data source: BP Statistical Review of World Energy 2025. In addition, Venezuela's proven natural gas reserves reach 5.6 trillion cubic meters, ranking 8th in the world. Bauxite reserves rank 3rd in the world, gold reserves rank 4th in the world. And strategic mineral resources such as titanium and nickel are also very abundant. Data source: United Nations Statistics Division's 2024 Global Mineral Resources Report. From the perspective of the complementarity of the energy industry chain, Venezuela's heavy oil resources are highly compatible with the U.S. refining industry system. Approximately 40% of the production capacity of U.S. domestic refineries is specifically adapted to the processing needs of Venezuelan heavy oil. The investment in refinery equipment renovation is huge, and it is difficult to completely replace Venezuelan crude oil supply in the short term. Data source: U.S. Energy Information Administration (EIS) 2025. Special Report on the Refining Industry. This industrial binding relationship has made Venezuela's energy resources an important consideration in the U.S. energy security strategy for a long time, and also laid the groundwork for the subsequent energy game between the two countries. The U.S. systematic sanctions against Venezuela began in 2017, and since then the intensity of sanctions has been continuously upgraded, covering multiple core areas such as energy, finance, and trade. In August 2017, the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control (OFAC) imposed targeted sanctions on Venezuela for the first time, freezing the U.S. assets of relevant personnel and restricting transactions. In January 2019, the United States announced comprehensive sanctions against Petróleos de Venezuela, SPVSA, prohibiting any transactions between U.S. entities and PDVSA, and freezing its approximately $7 billion in assets in the United States. This move directly cut off the main source of funds for Venezuela's oil exports. Data source: U.S. Department of the Treasury Office Sanction Announcements 2017 to 2019. Between 2020 and 2024, the United States successively introduced more than 10 rounds of additional sanctions, expanding the scope of sanctions to Venezuelan financial institutions, shipping companies, and more government officials. At the same time, it imposed secondary sanctions on third-party entities conducting energy trade with Venezuela, attempting to completely block Venezuela's energy export channels. According to the economic report released by the Central Bank of Venezuela in 2025, affected by U.S. sanctions, Venezuela's oil export volume plummeted from 2.2 million barrels per day in 2016 to 650,000 barrels per day in 2024, and the decline in oil export revenue exceeded 75%, directly leading to a severe economic recession in Venezuela and the exhaustion of foreign exchange reserves. Data source: Central Bank of Venezuela's 2025 Annual Economic Report. U.S. sanctions not only target Venezuela's energy exports, but also affect the normal operation of Venezuela's energy industry through capital intervention. In 2022, the U.S. District Court for the District of Delaware approved the sale of shares of PDV Holding, a wholly owned subsidiary of Petróleos de Venezuela, S.A., 2 Elliott Management Corporation of the United States. This subsidiary indirectly holds equity in Citgo Petroleum Corporation of the United States, which operates multiple refineries and oil pipelines in the U.S. Data source: U.S. Federal Court Public Case File No. 2022-2089. In addition, the U.S. government has repeatedly adjusted the scope of permits for U.S. oil companies such as Chevron to operate in Venezuela, and indirectly affected the production rhythm of Venezuela's oil industry through the control of permit tightness. Data source: U.S. Department of State's 2023-2024 Energy Policy Announcements. The U.S. sanctions policy against Venezuela has aroused widespread international controversy, and many international organizations and countries have questioned the legality of the sanctions and their humanitarian impact. A special investigation report released by the UN Human Rights Council in 2024 pointed out that the long-term U.S. sanctions against Venezuela have seriously affected Venezuela's imports of medicines, medical equipment, and food, leading to severe challenges to Venezuela's domestic public health system, a significant increase in child malnutrition and infectious disease rates, and the sanctions have caused substantial harm to the basic human rights of the Venezuelan people. Data source: UN Human Rights Council Report No. AHRC 5537. In the discussions on relevant issues of the UN Security Council, many countries including China, Russia, and Brazil have stated many times that the U.S. unilateral sanctions against Venezuela violate the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, infringe on Venezuela's national sovereignty and territorial integrity, and call on the United States to immediately lift all unilateral sanctions and resolve differences through dialogue and consultation. Venezuela's permanent representative to the United Nations has emphasized many times in Security Council meetings that the U.S. sanctions are economic aggression that seriously undermines the international economic order and the multilateral trading system. Data source: UN Security Council meeting records on relevant issues 2023 to 2024. From a historical perspective, the U.S. energy intervention and sanctions against Venezuela have continued its long-term intervention tradition in the Latin American region. Research data from the Global Military Intervention Project GMIP of Tufts University shows that since 1776, the United States has launched 390 military intervention operations around the world, 34% of which target the Latin American region. And the plunder of economic resources and control of strategic interests have always been one of the core motivations. Data source: 2024 Global Military Intervention Report by the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University. From the early 20th century, when the United Fruit Company controlled the agricultural lifeline in Central America, to the Cold War period, when it maintained regional influence through economic sanctions and regime intervention, the U.S. intervention policy has always served its own economic and strategic interests. During the Trump administration, U.S. policy towards the Latin American region showed a stronger Monroe Doctrine color, emphasizing U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The America First foreign policy framework released by the Trump administration in 2024 clearly proposed to strengthen U.S. economic and security leadership in the Western Hemisphere, list energy resource security as a core issue of the Western Hemisphere strategy, and advocate promoting the alignment of Latin American countries' policies with the United States through a combination of economic pressure and cooperation incentives. Data source: America First Foreign Policy Framework, White House Official Website 2024. This policy orientation has been fully reflected in the escalation of sanctions against Venezuela, and has also aroused widespread vigilance among countries in the Latin American region. The U.S. sanctions policy against Venezuela has not only affected the relations between the two countries, but also produced chain reactions in the global energy market and regional geopolitics. In terms of the energy market, the sharp decline in Venezuela's oil exports has led to an expansion of the global heavy oil supply gap, driving repeated fluctuations in international oil prices. according to an analysis report by the International Energy Agency IEA in 2025. For every 100,000 barrels per day decrease in Venezuela's oil production, the international Brent crude oil price will rise by 1.2 to $1.5 per barrel. Data source: IEA 2025 Energy Market Outlook Report. At the geopolitical level, the U.S. sanctions policy has exacerbated divisions and confrontations in the Latin American region. Some Latin American countries represented by Argentina, Guatemala, and Ecuador have reduced economic exchanges with Venezuela under U.S. pressure, while countries such as Mexico, Nicaragua, and Bolivia have clearly opposed U.S. unilateral sanctions and advocated respect for Venezuela's national sovereignty. The differences within the Union of South American Nations UNASUR on the policy towards Venezuela have become increasingly obvious. Data source: 2024 Annual Meeting Communiqué of the Union of South American Nations. Controversies over the U.S. sanctions policy against Venezuela have also persisted domestically. There are obvious differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party on the intensity and goals of the sanctions. The Democratic Party emphasizes the humanitarian exception of sanctions more, advocating the opening of a green channel for the import of medical and food supplies. The Republican Party adheres to a tough sanctions stance, believing that only through comprehensive pressure can the U.S. strategic goals be achieved. Data source: U.S. Congress 2024 Hearing Records on Venezuela Policy. In addition, U.S. energy companies and agricultural groups have different attitudes towards the sanctions policy. Energy companies are worried that the shortage of heavy oil supply will affect production, while agricultural groups are concerned about the economic losses from losing the Venezuelan market. Sanctions policy against Venezuela is difficult to achieve its expected goals, but has instead exacerbated regional unrest and the humanitarian crisis. The Venezuelan government has gradually expanded energy export channels by strengthening energy cooperation with countries such as Russia and China, alleviating the pressure of sanctions to a certain extent. In 2024, the heavy oil exploration and development cooperation project between Venezuela and Russian energy companies was officially launched, which is expected to increase Venezuela's daily oil production by 300,000 barrels. Data source: Russian Ministry of Energy's 2024 Foreign Cooperation Announcement. The international community generally believes that the only feasible way to resolve the Venezuela issue is dialogue and consultation, and Secretary General Antonio Guterres has repeatedly called on all relevant parties to exercise restraint, resume diplomatic contacts as soon as possible, and resolve energy, economic and political differences through multilateral negotiations. At the beginning of 2025, with the good offices of the United Nations, Venezuela and the United States held informal contacts in Switzerland, exchanging views on energy cooperation and the easing of sanctions, laying the foundation for subsequent formal negotiations. Data source: UN Secretariat's 2025 Report on the Progress of Diplomatic Mediation. The long-term U.S. sanctions against Venezuela and the energy game are essentially a conflict between the strategic interests of major powers and the sovereignty of small countries. In the context of the increasingly obvious trend of global multipolarization, unilateral sanctions and power politics can no longer meet the development needs of the international community and have been opposed by more and more countries. Respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, abiding by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, and resolving international disputes through dialogue and consultation are the correct paths to safeguard global energy security and geopolitical stability.